Dan Lungren has represented California's 3rd Congressional District, which stretches from Sacramento to the Sierra Nevada foothills since 2005. Dan graduated from the University of Notre Dame and received his law degree from Georgetown University. Dan serves as the chairman of the House Administrative Committee and is a respected colleague of the Judiciary Committee and the Homeland Security Committee, where he also serves as the chairman of the Subcommittee on Cybersecurity, Infrastructure Protection, and Security Technologies. Members of Congress from both sides of the aisle respect his thoughtful approach to problems. They know Dan Lungren as a man whose experience today allows him to move out in front of the difficulties of tomorrow. Dan's relentless work ethic has earned a sterling reputation in the areas of promoting flood protection, championing small business, and continuing to protect us through his work with Homeland Security. Dan helped author California's 3 Strikes Law and Megan's Law. Dan sees policy through the lens of a family man. He and his wife Bobby have 3 adult children, Jeff, Kelly, and Kathleen, and 6 grandchildren, Reagan, Julia, Jack, Alexandra, Andrew, and Fiona. And then talking with the congressman, he was born in Southern California, Long Beach area, and we talked a little bit about baseball, and we won't talk anything about what his team preference is, but he does say that he likes JT Snow, which is a good thing. So, with that, I'd like to bring to the mic Congressman Dan Lungren.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that introduction. It was nice of you to leave out the fact that I ran for governor. Well, it's been left out a lot because we ran a stealth campaign. It wasn't intended to be, but it ended up that way. So, and so I was, when I was Attorney General, I obviously was a state worker as well, and very much enjoyed the work that I did and the people that I was privileged to work with. This is an important subject that you're here to discuss today. I take it from a broader perspective than just information protection, information security in the cyber world. I'm one of those who believes that we don't pay enough attention to the entire issue of cybersecurity. And maybe it's because 30 years ago, the concept of cyber war was in the minds of only a few DoD researchers, academics, and novelists. And today, we recognize that our economy is so digitally connected, computers, iPads, Blackberries, you name it, that we struggle to protect our own personal information, intellectual property, and government secrets daily from cyber theft. President Obama indicated the gravity of this threat when he stated recently in the Wall Street Journal, quote, "Attacks in cyberspace pose the most serious economic and national security challenge America faces." Other experts have said that what is going on now is the greatest theft of intellectual property in the history of the United States, the history of the world. What does that mean for us? Well, we are the leaders in intellectual property. Our founding fathers in the Constitution recognized the importance of protecting intellectual property. They allowed it to have a property value. That's the whole idea of patents. That's the whole idea of trademarks. That's the whole idea of copyrights. That you can come up with an idea, you can utilize that idea, you can commercialize that idea, you can have it in the literary form, and you have a right to own that, you have a right to protect it. So when we are facing the greatest theft of intellectual property in the history of the United States, that is a serious problem. The President made his comments based on the fact that cyber attacks are growing more frequent, more sophisticated, and more dangerous. From 2009 to 2011, our nation experienced a 20-fold increase in cyber attacks. So we know the rate of cyber attacks is well over 1 per 60 or 90 seconds now. The rapid growth of the cyber threat is enabled by the information revolution and our nation's growing digital connectivity. The information revolution launched by the internet has reached into all corners of our lives. You know that, I know that. And more than that, our kids and our grandkids know that. It provides users many benefits, but it also exposes us to new risks in the area of cyber criminality, spies, terrorists, using the internet as a pathway to our personal bank accounts, intellectual property, and even our critical infrastructure. One of the most sophisticated cyber attacks that has been made public has been identified as the Stuxnet malware, which targets critical infrastructure. You're all aware of this. All you have to do is open up the front page of the New York Times and find all about it, if that happens to be true. Whoever utilized that, thank goodness they were utilizing it, I believe, in the best interest of the United States. But what is it? Stuxnet is an offensive weapon in the area of cyber. It's designed to cause physical damage by interfering with a facility's critical operations, i.e. its control system. As described, at least in the general media, it was something that was able to, it was a foreign directed piece of malware that was able to enter into a control system, lay seemingly dormant for some period of time, give off counterfeit signals that in fact everything was going well, and then in actuality provide signals to the control system which caused destruction of physical property, in that case centrifuges to destroy themselves. I think the evidence is that whoever was responsible for it was successful in backing down, or at least creating a major bump in the road for the Iranian government development of a nuclear weapon. But if that exists for the good guys, it now exists for the bad guys. We should realize that Stuxnet-like programs are out there today, directed at all sorts of things in this country and in this state. Not only state government, not only your operations, but federal operations as well, and pieces of critical infrastructure. One of the pieces of the critical infrastructure I'm most concerned about is Folsom Dam. Not just because I happen to live downstream of it, but because I know a catastrophic failure of that dam would have consequences that we've never seen here in our area, both in terms of loss of life and loss of physical property. So, Stuxnet is a game changer. It raises the stakes in a war on terror by demonstrating how cyber attacks can destroy critical infrastructure, the very backbone of our productive economy. So I agree with President Obama that cyber attacks on critical infrastructure will impact our national and economic security, as well as jeopardize the health and safety of our citizens. So what do? Most of the critical infrastructure that our nation depends on is not owned by the government on any level. It is privately owned and operated. Currently, private industry is in fact responsible for protecting its own assets from cyber attack on a voluntary basis. With the government having access to intelligence not available to the private sector, knowing how their systems are configured and operated, it would make sense that you have a confluence of interest there, and that both sides would attempt to work together in a public-private partnership. Federal policy already recognizes the importance of public-private partnership model to coordinate policy and information sharing, including the dissemination of sensitive cyber threat information. A 2010 GAO report concluded that this model, however, needs improvement. Private sector partners complain they get very little of what they need. That is actionable threat information. That means information that is relevant to them and is timely. That they get very little of this from the government. The reason usually given is that no secure mechanisms exist for sharing actionable threat information. The private sector also hesitates because they fear sharing their proprietary information with the federal government for fear of public disclosure and perhaps liability. The inherent mistrust between government and the private sector has to be overcome. We've been trying to work on that back in Washington, D.C. The cybersecurity regulatory framework is not necessarily conducive to a trusted relationship. You've got the concern, if I give this information to government, is government going to use that information on a fishing expedition on something else I might have done? If I get this information out, will it show a vulnerability that will then get out and have other people attempting to exploit that vulnerability? Will it show my competitors where I'm vulnerable? Will my ratepayers, will my shareholders then have less trust in what it is we do? So it inhibits communication and stifles cooperation. My feeling is that government should facilitate, not mandate, cybersecurity improvements. I think we should incentivize critical infrastructure owners to improve their cyber security practices rather than mandate these standards. And that has been a real battle in DC. I have a bill that's somewhere between the Collins-Lieberman bill and the McCain bill. But I've had some negative reaction in the private sector because they think even voluntary participation, incentivized by liability protections, is the first step towards the slippery slope of heavy regulation. And despite all of my explanations thus far, we've not been able to overcome that, but I do believe we have to. My fear is that we'll have a major cybersecurity attack in this nation which affects critical infrastructure in a major way such that we will have a significant impact on our economic life or loss of life. And in that environment, we have a tendency to overreact. And my idea is that we try and act before the crisis rather than after. Information sharing, specifically threat information, is critical to an effective cyber defense strategy. If you don't know the threat, it's awfully tough to defend against it. The more the cyber threat is understood, the better the private sector and government can protect the networks. So I strongly support sharing as much actionable threat information with the private sector as possible. We actually did pass legislation this year in the House. It is part of that being considered in the Senate, which in fact gave a better basis for this kind of threat information analysis and sharing than we've had before. But what was missing in our House-passed legislation was any effort to address the cyber vulnerabilities of our woefully underprotected critical infrastructure. Look, some in Washington argued that sharing cyber threat information was sufficient to defend against cyber attacks. As long as we gave that information out in a timely fashion, that would be necessary. But I don't agree with that, and I'm not alone. General Keith Alexander, the head of the U.S. Cyber Command and NSA, stated earlier this year that while information sharing is important, it is not enough. We also need to raise critical infrastructure cybersecurity standards. Again, I've tried to do this not by government mandate, but by a voluntary set of performance standards that would be determined in cooperation between the private sector and the public sector, and that you would get a buy-in by the private sector in that they would have these liability protections. Still haven't been able to get there, but it just seems to me, I would explain it this way. Former Secretary of DHS Chertoff said it. You have a piece of critical infrastructure. Remember, 85% of critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector, not by the public, so it's non-governmental. You got a piece of it. And they look at the possibilities of major cybersecurity intrusion. They make a determination that if that happened, they would suffer losses on behalf of themselves and their customers, clients, whatever, of $1 billion. So they may be willing to take the kinds of steps necessary to protect against a $1 billion loss. But as Secretary Chertoff said, their loss in that industry would cascade into a $50 billion loss to the United States. And it's that difference between the $50 billion and the $1 billion whether we need to have a government opportunity to work with the private sector. A great example of why we need to be concerned about cyber threats to critical infrastructure is the nation's electrical grid. Now, some would say the most critical of our nation's infrastructures. Our economy, as you know, is dependent on the reliable supply of electric power. You don't have to think too long ago. How about the East Coast blackout of 2003? While power was restored for the majority of those affected within 48 hours, the cost to our economy was between $6 and $10 billion. Think if it had been extended for a month or so. Recently, I was back in Washington, D.C., waiting to get on an airplane to come back here. Our flight was delayed. We had to stay overnight at the airport. During that time, something called a derecho came through. I never even heard of a derecho. D-E-R-E-C-H-O. Does everybody know what a derecho is? It's a series of powerful thunderstorms that come together with hurricane-level winds, but it's not a hurricane. And it knocked out electricity to the Washington, D.C. area, the Baltimore area, for some people up to several weeks. Most people up to 48 hours. You can't imagine the dislocation that occurred in that short period of time. That is just a small example of what a disturbance of that which we rely on, our electrical power, would do to us. The electric grid is one of the most complex networks ever engineered, capable of generating millions of watts of power over hundreds of thousands of miles of transmission lines to over 300 million people here in North America. The grid's also resilient with power usually restored quickly after devastating storms and disturbances. Unfortunately, today's threats aren't just those storms, stray animals, petty vandalism. Along with the rest of our economy, the grid has become more dependent on computers and networks to reduce costs and increase efficiency. They therefore are far more vulnerable to our malicious attacks that we've described. Luckily, we haven't had a widespread debilitating cyber attack on our electric grid, but we can't just keep saying that we're going to be so lucky. A lot of good efforts are being made, but believe me, the bad guys are out there attempting to do it. We don't have just the mischievous teenagers. We've got individual criminals out there. We have major criminal enterprises. We have transnational terrorist organizations. And we have nation states that, frankly, are not our friends. Everybody's afraid to talk about which nation states out there are doing stuff. I don't know. I won't name them, but it starts with a C and ends with an A. A target of our cyber attacks is the federal government networks, as well as the state of California and every other state's network. What should the proper role of government be in protecting our networks, federal and state? I believe we need a governmental agency to have be the operational leader in protecting us on the federal level. We have a cyber coordinator in the White House, but he, some believe, properly focuses on policy rather than operations. The various government departments have individual responsibility for protecting their own networks, but the overall federal network security needs coordination. Unfortunately, no agency has been designated by statute to protect our government communication systems and networks. Some say, well, NASA should perform that. You know, they know more about it. Technically, they're the big guys on the block. But NASA NSA, when I say NASA, not NSA, it happens to be within the Department of Defense. We have an aversion in this country to having the military controlling the civilian. And there are some constitutional restrictions on there, and there's some statutory restrictions on that. I think the Department of Homeland Security is the one to be so designated. It has greatly improved its cyber capability, and it's the logical lead cybersecurity agency for the federal networks, in other words, on the domestic side of things. And by the way, General Alexander of NSA agrees on that. So what are we trying to do? Well, we have some responsibility in the Congress itself. How do we protect our technology? I happen to be the chairman of the House Administration Committee. That used to be an important position. He used to be known as the mayor of Capitol Hill. And boy, when people came to you for favors, did you have the IOUs in your back pocket? But that doesn't happen anymore. So I have oversight for things such as the IT network of the House, the U.S. Police, or Capitol Police Department. I have members who come to me to know what they can spend and how they can spend it and whether it's allowed under the rules. I also had a member come to me a couple months ago saying, can you do something about getting the bird crap off my window? He had tried to have that done, and I will tell you, within 12 hours I had his windows cleaned. So I go from the sublime to the absolutely absurd. But one of the things that I do have is oversight over the House IT network. And we have our own program of cybersecurity, 24/7, 365 days a year. We are the subject of millions of attempted cyber attacks. And you know, one of the toughest things I've got, and one of the things I think that we need to do in state government and the private sector and so forth, is better computer hygiene, better technology hygiene. To give you an example how tough that is, because people think it's common sense, BlackBerry, right? Okay, if I don't use this, I think it's every 5 minutes, you know, it locks down, I have to unlock it with my passcode. I've had members come to me and say, oh, this is a pain in the neck. Can't you give us 24 hours? I'm serious. And I said, well, 5 minutes is about the best I can give you. This one member, a senior member came to me and said, give us 24 hours, this is a pain in the neck. I said, you have to understand. What if you lose this thing? Oh, if I lost it, I'd let you know right away. So I just offhandedly said, well, have you ever lost your official life? Yeah, but that was 2 years ago. I said, well, how long was it until you found it? He said, oh, I never found it. I left it on an airplane. And they say, besides, this is non-classified information. Why is anybody interested in this? So let me give you an example of why they might be interested in this. Remember 9/11, they told us we didn't connect the dots. In the area of cybersecurity, you got to connect the dots. Let us say that it is known that there are key people in the House and the Senate, leadership in the House and the Senate, that are either by statute or by practice notified whenever there is a major national security incident anywhere in the country. Probably about 8 people. You know, the Speaker of the House, the Minority Leader of the House, the President of the Senate, the Minority Leader of the Senate, the people that are the chairman and the ranking members on the House Intelligence Committee and the Senate Intelligence Committee. So let's say that you are a nation state or you are a transnational terrorist organization and you carry out a terrorist operation somewhere in the world of real importance, but it is done covertly. And you discover that within 20 minutes, all of those people I just named to you have received notice on their BlackBerries to either have a phone call or go to a meeting on a matter of urgency. You might take that information with other information to figure out, you know something, the United States was aware of our covert attack. They were able to determine the attack within 20 minutes. Not only were they able to determine the attack within 20 minutes, they were able to determine the significance of the attack such that it rose to the level that they had to give notice to these people. That's just a simple bit of information as to how seemingly unimportant information would be of real value to the intelligence community of another. And while information sharing is important, I agree with General Alexander, the head of the U.S. Cyber Command, who believes that the standards to protect critical infrastructure are as important as information sharing when defending against cyber attacks. So I'm co-sponsoring a bill in the House with my subcommittee's Democratic ranking member, Congresswoman Clark, which identifies the cyber risk to our numerous economic sectors. If we can't get, at this stage of the game, a mechanism by which there is the sharing of information and, in addition to that, some minimum standards, performance standards, at least we can set out some mechanism by which we have to establish what the numerous, or what the cyber risk is in our numerous economic sectors. We're in an unsettled position in the Congress right now. We know that we have to do cybersecurity. We haven't worked our way through it. In Congress, the magic number is 218 in the House. You got to get 218 people to pass it. In the Senate, it should be 50 plus 1, that is 51, but it often is 60 because they have to be able to break a filibuster there. They haven't been able to get enough votes on the Senate side. My hope is that we will, in fact, not reach a position where we have a major attack on our country and then respond. What you are doing is extremely important. The emphasis put on the idea of security of information in the California state government is extremely important. We have to do that at the governmental level. We have to do that at the federal level. the state government level, the federal level. We have to do that in the private sector. We need to have what I would call the cyber equivalent to Smokey the Bear. We got to figure out a way of making people aware of what they need to do. And that doesn't mean people won't make mistakes. I mean, I made a mistake. I mentioned this at a little luncheon next door. You know, I forget whether it's McAfee or it's Words Norton, but whoever I've got protecting my computer, I got a notice, update, subject to attack unless you update. So normally I don't pay that. I thought, you know, I'm going to be a good follower of this. I'm going to do good cyber hygiene, so I clicked on. Well, it's only after I clicked on that I realized that it was a counterfeit. It looked a lot like mine. It looked like the notices I got. And of course, my system went nuts for some period of time and had to go have it taken care of. So even when you're trying to do it, you're going to make mistakes. But my point is, most of us aren't trying to do it enough. Most of us don't know. Most people are not computer experts. I think they view their computer like their refrigerator. You open your refrigerator, you really don't care what makes it cold. You just want it cold. You know a couple of simple things. You don't leave the door open. You know, I mean, that's intuitive. You realize that you have to keep it at a certain control. You realize that the freezer compartment is different than the regular refrigerator compartment. I mean, you recognize, though, people don't, at least those of us who are over 13, don't understand intuitively how you protect your computer. So we need to have a better campaign for that. We need to raise the issue of cybersecurity among all Americans because we are all tied to cyber world, whether we like it or not. And let me put it this way. If I were to do a major attack on the United States and I wanted to use the least amount of capital as possible, raise the fewest number of people in arms, the area I would go is the new domain of warfare, which is cyber. I get more bang for my buck. I can probably do more damage in more different ways than I could trying to raise an army. Because I can't raise an army the size of the United States. But I can look for vulnerabilities everywhere to the American society, the most open society in the history of the world, which utilizes the cyber world to advance that openness, thereby exposes itself to tremendous vulnerabilities. And we have to do something to protect against the exploitation of those vulnerabilities. You are charged in part with that responsibility. I salute you for that. I thank you for your dedication. And I just say, let's do a better job of informing our neighbors, our family members, and others of the importance of what it is you do and what we have to do to spread the word of cybersecurity and commit ourselves, both in the private sector and the governmental sector, to advance that. Thank you very, very much. Oh, they said I could answer some questions if anybody wants to ask any. Yes, sir.
How do you feel about all the public information on the internet that we're posting that shows like latitude, longitude of control system field elements, pipelines?
Yeah, we're trying to cut back. We're trying to cut back on that. As you remember, after 9/11, there was actually legislation on the federal level that required that information to be out, and there was that was held back for some period of time. More recently, there was an effort on the federal level. I'm trying to think of which agency it was, but they were going back to the old way of doing things. On our subcommittee on a bipartisan basis, we said, hey, that doesn't sound like a smart thing to do. Let's think about that. And one of the problems was the agency of regulatory authority hadn't really even talked with DHS or others about this problem. So one of our concerns is how do we coordinate in the federal government domain in a better way, and we are trying to tell them to pull back on some of that, because it just doesn't, when you really think about it, this new world, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Yes, sir.
I was wondering if there's anybody in the state of California that has the authority to request the telcos to shut off the internet in the case of an extreme denial of service attack. I've talked to the FBI and the CHP, and until President Obama signed the executive order giving himself the authority to do so, he seems to be the only one that can do that. But the commonality in most of these denial of service attacks is overseas combatants trying to attack our resources. We have nothing in place and no authority in place to do anything about that. Is there anything you're doing to address that?
I have no knowledge of the state having the ability to do that sort of thing. I will tell you that was a controversial issue, continues to be a controversial issue. Some people saying, aha, well, they want to do the same thing in the United States that they did in China or some of these other totalitarian countries. And the power of the president in those circumstances has been vastly exaggerated, and I think we're still working out what the appropriate response would be to a cyber security attack against a or by a foreign nation, and under what circumstances the president may be able to act. Look, if the effect of the attack would be to render the internet, domestic internet, unworkable, then you could see why it might make sense for a president to have certain authority. But they would have to be under very, very extreme circumstances. And a lot of what's appeared in the public has been inaccurate about what power the president has by executive order, by statute right now. Okay. Well, thank you very, very much. Oh, yes, sir.
Since the largest impedance to doing good security seems to be economic, the person at home isn't paying for antivirus because it's too much for them. The small business isn't doing the things they need to do. I've sat in presentations from the various different telephone vendors, and they've showed us how much traffic they see that's malicious. And they offer up a service that you can pay for to do that. Has anybody put any thought into doing something like we do with the emergency services and having a socialized cost, and have, at the very least, the telcos do minimal policing where they're just basically making people stay within the confines of what is appropriate network behavior?
That has been one of the areas of discussion in the House and the Senate as to where the responsibility lies for various actions of protection and mitigation. But it goes beyond just where the responsibility may be found. It goes to the question of privacy. In some cases, in order to protect against certain attacks, you have to know, you have to get down to the content, or pretty close to the content. And so in doing that, you are, quote unquote, invading the privacy of the ultimate user or consumer. So the question is, do you somehow mandate that in legislation with people knowing about it, or do you have the various vendors give their users the opportunity to opt into that kind of a program? And then the question would be, under what circumstances and how far down does the vendor or provider, how far do they drill down? And so you do have the privacy questions that come into play. And so it's not just an easy thing to say, okay, we're going to demand that the provider at this level take those steps that would be necessary automatically to protect that intrusion. Or you say the opportunity is provided for that, and you sort of make it so transparent that most people would say, yes, I'm going to do that. Now, yes, I want to sign up for it, opt into it. At the same time, you got to have some protections. There's not a misuse of that information. So you have to have some liability. And so you've got some providers that say, hey, wait a second, you're putting us on the horns on a dilemma. You're telling us that we're supposed to do that on the one hand, then you're not providing any liability protection against that if, it's an innocent mistake or what we thought was an intrusion does not turn out to be an intrusion because the bad guys are pretty good about camouflaging what they do. And so in some ways, maybe the government has to be the honest broker in there. And how you do that is one of the confounding things that we have. But you're absolutely right. On a good portion of this, vendors at certain levels, providers at certain levels are in the best position to be able to detect an attempted intrusion and protect against that. So the question is, do they have your permission to protect against that? How sure do they have to be about whether that is an intrusion? And fundamentally, how far do they have to drill down before they can make that determination? And does that invade your privacy in any way? I'll just show the irony of the whole thing. Young people today are probably, and I'm talking about teenagers and 20s and so forth, they're probably the most personal privacy conscious generation we've ever had. Yet they, as opposed to other generations, put more stuff on the internet by way of social media than any generation's ever had. They lay their whole life open to the world, and then they're surprised when someone uses it. So that's probably a distillation of the ironies and the challenges we have with the cyber world. We want the connectivity because of what it allows us, but we don't want the vulnerability that necessarily comes with that connectivity. Thanks very much.
I just want to say again, Congressman, we appreciate the support that you're providing to us at the federal level, and thanks again for being here. Cool.